All right, I believe we are live. Hello and welcome to live programming at the More Freedom Foundation. Today we are going to be discussing The Economist, a periodical that I enjoy very much, but also take with a pretty heavy grain of salt. And hopefully by the end of this chat, you'll have a sense of why that is. Just some preliminaries. What's going on here is we're going to have a conversation. Jon Coumes and I, Jon Coumes from Safe for Democracy, one of my favorite podcasts covering U.S. history and foreign policy disasters. We're going to have this conversation for about an hour or so. There's a live chat that you are welcome to join in on. Please be civil to each other. Feel free to be as scathing as you want of what Jon and I are saying, and abusive as you want. Do not be abusive of each other. If you are, if you're aggressively creating problems in the chat, you will be blocked. I don't really have the bandwidth to pay attention, but Jon usually does a better job of pointing out who's just a waste of space on the chat. And if you are that, you will be blocked. So please try to be civil to each other and have a good conversation. Once we move to the Q&A period, Jon and I won't have the leisure to go back and look at all the questions that have been asked earlier. So just ask your questions again, and we'll try to get to them. So Jon, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jon Coumes, like Rob says. I run the Safe for Democracy podcast. We cover the darker side of U.S. foreign policy, the disasters in U.S. foreign policy. We started with the coup against Arbenz in Guatemala in '54, the coup against Mossadegh in Iran in '53 was the second series, and right now we're talking about Vietnam, although it's questionable whether or not we'll even get to Kennedy, but we will thoroughly cover the French involvement in the war. The next show that's going to come out is probably the first half of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and then the next one will be the end of the French War and the start of the Americans fully taking over the puppet regime in the South. So that's my show. Safe for Democracy at safefordemocracy.com. And like I said, Rob says I'll be in the chat hanging out.
Fantastic. By way of preliminaries, the only thing I'd like to mention, if this is the first video you're looking at on my channel, I love doing these live chats. It's fun to talk with Jon. It's fun to interact with folks. But if you're looking for a sense of what I do here, I would not recommend one of these 2-hour chats. I'd go for one of the shorter videos that you can find on the channel. That's sort of, that's my passion. That's what I put together. It's usually 3 to 5 minute productions that I put a lot of time and effort into, discussing some aspect of most often recently U.S. foreign policy, but also politics history. I'll occasionally do a film review, but those are much shorter, much more digestible. This is a longer format and probably doesn't give the best sense of what I like to do. So I figured we should just launch into it. Today we're going to discuss The Economist. Now, The Economist is actually a periodical that I love. It's one of my main sources for news and analysis. I've been a big fan for a long, long time. But after 20 years of more or less reading the thing cover to cover, I've also formed a lot of sort of pet peeves and a lot of issues with the way that they cover certain things. The Economist, which I think is very admirable, tries to be very upfront about its biases. It is a proudly sort of neoliberal, classical liberal publication. It focuses on, it very clearly champions the sort of old school free trade, pro-capitalism line, and it's never very silent about that. But what I think Jon and I would like to tease out in this conversation by focusing on 3 articles in particular is the way that there are some unannounced biases that play a really large role in reporting. And we'll talk about that, the way that their biases work that aren't as obvious, both their announced and unannounced biases in the way that they cover certain topics. So I think this is going to be an interesting conversation. For those who don't know, what I like so much about The Economist is its attempt to cover everything. and try to cover everything in depth. I mean, if you look at, a given, what is it, 70 or 80 page magazine, I mean, it's all fairly dense, and, they try to get a lot of detail in there, but it's also very engagingly written. And it will, long before I had any other sense of anything else in the world, it provided a window onto whole regions. Each magazine is broken down in sections. There'll be Middle East and Africa, the United States, China, Asia. I mean, it's a fantastic publication. If you're not aware of it, you should probably be reading it. But also, you should not, just as you shouldn't read anything without a critical eye, you should definitely be reading this publication with a critical eye, because on certain topics, and really in every issue, I assure you, The Economist is full of it. John, you want to give an intro of your views of the publication?
Well, we'll get more into this later. The problems that The Economist shares with virtually all media nowadays. I don't have a particular beef with The Economist being a little more neoliberal, in the same way that the Wall Street Journal is a little bit more liberal. I mean, neoliberal, rather. Although I think the Journal gets even farther to the right. Mm-hmm. But the thing that I do like about The Economist, that I think Rob and I have talked about before on these shows, is that British media almost or maybe definitely as sort of a vestige as their role as sort of, the world imperial leader, still takes an enlightened interest in virtually every region in the world. So the same way that the BBC has better coverage of international events than pretty much any American media does, The Economist has better coverage of international events than pretty much any American magazine does.
Absolutely.
I think that's worth reading, as Rob says.
Yeah. I think actually it'd probably be worthwhile to say what we mean by neoliberal, because that isn't necessarily clear to everybody. In the United States, we have this weird usage of the term liberal as sort of as an insult. It's like a pejorative term. But neoliberal, actually, in Europe, and I think more broadly sort of across the world, is actually kind of the opposite. If you're talking about a liberal faction in most countries in the world, what you're actually talking about are the pro-business stuff. So when we say that The Economist is neoliberal, we're actually talking about a bunch of leanings and biases that in the US political mind map towards conservatism. So they're very pro-business. They're very, they're very explicitly pro-business. Well, I think, I didn't go through the Economist Wikipedia page in detail, but my understanding is that the magazine was launched about 170 years ago to advocate for free trade in Britain itself. I think it comes out of the Corn Law controversy, which the Corn Law controversy, which I've been looking into a bit as part of my sort of long promised book on the British Empire that I'm working on. And basically what The Economist was advocating for was the end of tariffs on foodstuffs being imported into the United Kingdom. So they've been remarkably consistent for sort of closing in on 200 years in being pro-business, pro-markets, so that's sort of what we mean by neoliberal. And I'm actually kind of interested, John, like I'd sort of expected you, I mean, perhaps it's a caricature in my head. I'd sort of seen you as leaning a little more pro-left, and thought that you might have some resentments against The Economist for that.
Well, yeah, we'll get into this a little bit later after we talk about the articles, I think. But the reason I don't have particular beef with The Economist is that all mainstream media is neoliberal. And if you go to the stuff that we in the United States consider farther right, like Fox News, you're getting into something that's not even liberal anymore. It's this other, the way that Fox News champions Trump's tariffs right now. They've left the conservative sphere of American politics, and they're trending towards, I don't know, like an idiot's version of fascism.
It's really hard to describe, and that's kind of interesting that the way that Trump is forcing certain outlets in. I mean, being against free trade is, maybe stop me if I'm wrong here, but that has elements of left-wing politics, or at least the way, not in the 19th century, but in the 20th century, I think it was, you could rely on unions to be very skeptical of free trade agreements that that would involve possibly factories moving overseas and competition from lower income labor. So it's really kind of interesting to watch Fox News turn commie, turn kind of anti-trade and anti this whole thing that sort of Western civilization has been biased towards for the past 2 centuries. It's sort of
yeah. And I mean, the key difference there is if you look at left movements, especially in the 20th century, when they look at trade agreements, what they want isn't necessarily to put up trade barriers and keep trade within countries. What they want is free trade agreements that make provision within a country to balance out winners and losers. Mm-hmm. And what I mean there is you take something like NAFTA, right? NAFTA, just by the numbers, has benefited both Mexico, Canada, and the United States, right? Our economies have grown quicker, not much quicker, but quicker because of NAFTA.
Yeah.
But tons of people got screwed by NAFTA in the United States, Canada, and Mexico at the outset. People in auto factories in the United States that moved to Mexico, stuff that happened in Mexico. And what we want on the left is that when you institute a new trade agreement, you make provision for the people who are going to be hurt, and you help to redistribute the surplus created by that trade agreement to the people down below. Which is where you get the opposition, the WTO protests in Seattle and stuff. Not everyone on the left is super considered, but yeah. Whereas the Fox version of conservatism or this new anti-trade position is anything that Donald Trump says goes.
Yeah.
And no one's going to help out the people who are going to be hurt by screwing up NAFTA. Like those people in that factory in, what was it, Idaho, the nail factory, where they're just moving all the nail production down to Mexico.
Yeah.
And the point is the Trump administration is not going to take care of the people that get hurt by this trade war.
No, of course not. But it is fascinating just watching the convolutions that sort of pro-Trump media have to go through. And that's why you've got so many conservative thinkers who actually thought there was something consistent to the worldview of the Republican Party, just suffering from whiplash and sort of, and then a lot of less principled conservative thinkers just trying to figure out how to stay on Trump's team. But that's another topic we might be falling off a bit. So I don't know. We might as well just launch right into it and discuss the first of the three articles. I think to get to probably the meat of a critique of The Economist that both John and I agree on, I think it'd probably be best to start off by looking at this jihad article. I believe it's in the print edition either this week or next week under the title "Jihad's New Base." Or something along those lines. John, you want to sort of introduce this article and its issue, or would you rather?
No, I could talk about it. Like all the articles we're going to talk about in the show, it's pretty short. It's to the point. It's well written, like everything the Economist does.
Yeah.
And what it's talking about.
I'd quibble with that, actually. I think The Economist more and more, I've noticed, has got some real copy editing issues. Like the number of just like glaring typos that I've been finding recently, which is interesting because as I've gotten older, my brain has turned into mush, and I'm actually much worse at proofreading and finding things than I used to be. So I want to say, when I was reading The Economist 20 years ago, I never saw this sort of thing, but today, yeah, I mean it's amazing. You can find typos on almost every page now. But
your book was pristine.
What's that?
I said your book was pristine. I read the first draft of the first half of Rob's book, and it was great, guys.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to hear that. But no, I'm talking about my writing, which is, that's my writing, which is No, I'm talking about my. I used to have a much more finely tuned radar for other people's errors, and even in this sort of rotten radar that I have today, I'm seeing more and more typos in The Economist, which is really quite grim. But anyway, that's probably neither here nor there. Sorry, I derailed you there for a bit. I just wanted to fucking complain about typos in The Economist.
Well, this jihadis in North Africa article we're talking about, which I'll as soon as I'm done explaining this, I'll link it in the chat.
Yeah.
It's talking about how now that ISIS has been more or less thoroughly defeated, branches of it and ideologies that are similar to it are moving into North Africa, which is not a new situation by any means.
No.
And talking about how North Africa is a pretty unstable place, which again is not a new situation by any means. But the argument of the article is that we've got something like 6,000 special forces and advisors and otherwise military personnel in North Africa right now, advising different regimes. And something I was reading a week ago, actually running military operations with the troops of those regimes, which is, I think, not allowed by any laws. But the point is, Donald Trump, or at least people working for Donald Trump, are thinking about drawing down those commitments in North Africa. And the article's argument is that that's a bad idea. And hold on, let me pull up the last words of it here, which I have on my other monitor, because they are choice. Hold on, guys. Yeah, all right. The last word, which sums up the last sentence, which sums up the argument of the entire piece, is Western troops are insurance against disaster. That is in North Africa. We should keep paying the premiums. Making the argument in the previous sentence that the Sahel, the only thing stopping the Sahel from falling apart are American troops, and stopping it from falling apart would be easier than putting it back together. That's an argument that's disingenuous on levels, and then also wrong. And I think Rob can speak to that.
Yeah, what's extraordinary about this article is, and it's interesting because it also demonstrates what can be so great about The Economist and what is so vital about real print journalism that can afford journalists and this, that, and the other thing, is there's actually information in this 5-paragraph article that I had been killing myself to find for some videos earlier this year, specifically talking about US and Chinese involvement in Africa. Like it provides those actual troop figures with 6,000 US troops in Africa generally. That's fantastic. I couldn't find that information. I am quite confident that most US senators do not know that information. And The Economist found it. And it's got that information, and it's got information on French troop levels, which I had to run through a whole range of articles and sources to actually find. So that's great. It's great that The Economist has this information, but because of the story it's trying to pitch, it also leaves out incredibly important information, which is like how this sort of jihadist problem in this arc of Africa actually started. In the article, it discusses Bill Clinton's choice to leave Somalia in 1993. And I suppose you could, maybe for the 90s, make the pitch that contributed to the disintegration of Somalia. But with some history I've been reading recently, and I'm nowhere near as conversant with Somali history and the issues of that conflict as I'd like to be. I actually think I should probably do a series on that at some point in the coming years and read the relevant books. But sort of going through what has happened in Somalia, not in the 90s, but in the aughts, sort of in the early war on terror years. Somalia was in complete chaos throughout the 90s, forming the sort of mental image we all have of Somalia. But what started happening in the early 2000s is there was an organization called the Islamic Courts. And it's kind of interesting because this Economist article does sort of obliquely reference that. And yeah, these guys were Sharia oriented, and I think did, occasionally use some draconian methods to do things. But what they had managed to do, the exact timeline isn't clear for me, was they had actually managed to assert a level of control and peace in Somalia. Once again, at some point between 2003 and 2006 or so. And what happened was the United States said, wait a second, this doesn't sound like our sort of thing, and got super freaking involved in Somalia again, and funded a range of powers surrounding Somalia to go in and destroy the Islamic courts. Of course, the result of that was an intensification of radicalization, and that's how we got Al-Shabaab, that like horrific organization that's responsible for many of the worst acts of terror that we've seen over the past decade. So this sort of jihadism is created by U.S. military power. What is not mentioned in this article, and is shameful, frankly, is the fact that this whole arc of instability in Mali, Nigeria was already dealing with Boko Haram, but what sort of infused it with more energy, money, and fighters was the destruction of Libya, which was undertaken by the United States, France, and the United Kingdom in 2011. That country is still a mess, has got at least 3 separate governments, and is just spinning off weapons, money, and destruction all across West Africa. Really all across Northern Africa. And that's why Mali almost fell to Islamic insurgents in, I believe, 2013. That's why the French had to sort of ramp up their military involvement. And there's just so much that is left out of this article that serves to completely demolish its thesis. And I think that gets to the very, very strong bias that The Economist has, and that is shared by across all large-scale media that we consume in the United States and Europe, both left and right. Fox News has this bias, CNN has this bias, the New York Times has this bias. Occasionally the freaking Nation has this bias. And it is a bias towards military action, and specifically the interpretations of military action that are laid out by the governments in question. It has gotten worse, actually, recently, because of just how strapped for cash and funding these journalism institutions have become. They've basically, if you've got a big issue like Iraq or Syria, a lot, journalistic organizations can afford to send people there and kind of figure out what's actually going on on the ground, which has made my projects related to Iraq and Syria possible, because there are dissenting voices. In most of North Africa, what The Economist does, what a wide range of institutions do, is really just reprint press releases from the Department of Defense. It's quite extraordinary. And I'm not just talking about The Economist or other more generalist institutions. I have a friend who works for the Wall Street Journal, and his promotion from Turkey was to be the guy who covers all of Africa. And he's certainly got some people working under him, but all of Africa is sort of what he's responsible for. That means that him and, I don't know, I haven't spoken to him in a number of years, but he and the 5 to 10 people he might have working for him are responsible for putting together every piece of reporting for Africa. Be it business reporting, the 54 countries of Africa, or is it 50? Anyway, be it the business reporting, the lifestyle reporting. If there's a gallery opening that sounds interesting, the Wall Street Journal wants to write something about. That's his team working on it, and he's also, of course, responsible for the Wall Street Journal's coverage of military and security, not just in North Africa, but in all of Africa. And that's the world we live in right now. And it's a world that The Economist just completely pretends does not exist, with this laughable article telling us that what we really need is more troops in North Africa. It's just...
There's a couple of things I'm going to talk about on that point. And the first one comes from a book by Noam Chomsky, who's a left thinker that Rob, I imagine, is not a huge fan of.
Hey, man, manufacturing consent is true, but a lot of what he says is garbage.
Yeah. Well, Manufacturing Consent is Chomsky's book about the nature of news production and its relationship to the state in the West, and especially in the United States. And he has this paragraph that's beautiful. It's talking about exactly what Rob was just talking about. And it's about the costs associated with the production of news. So, quote, in effect, the large bureaucracies of the powerful, that is the state, subsidize the mass media and gain special access by their contributions to reducing the media's costs of acquiring the raw materials of and producing news, unquote. So this is what Rob's talking about. Small team covering all of Africa. They may have stringers in every country in Africa. They may have sources on the ground.
I'm sure they do.
They're incentivized to use whatever news comes to them because it lowers their day-to-day cost of producing the Wall Street Journal. So continuing, quote, the large entities that provide this subsidy become routine news sources and have privileged access to the gates, that is, access to the news people. Non-routine sources, people like Rob, perhaps, or people trying to get a different narrative out of North Africa, must struggle for access and may be ignored by the arbitrary decision of the gatekeepers, that is, the people who produce news. It should also be noted that in the case of the largesse of the Pentagon and the State Department's Office of Public Diplomacy, largesse in the sense that they produce a lot of news that these people can then turn into their newspaper, the subsidy is at the taxpayer's expense, so that, in effect, the citizenry pays to be propagandized in the interests of powerful groups such as the military, unquote, which is what we were just talking about. And this is what I was mentioning earlier. I don't have a particular beef with the Economist or the Wall Street Journal because every mainstream news source, even supposedly left-leaning news sources like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, or the Washington Post and the New York Times, are biased towards the establishment, biased towards the government narrative, biased towards whatever narrative that's coming out of Washington, D.C. So the thing that, sorry, you're good.
No, please continue.
So the thing that bugs me about this article is that it uncritically takes military intervention, the kind that does not see the light of day, because did you know we had 6,000 people on the ground? And if you did, do you know what they're doing in North Africa? Not you, Rob, but anybody who's listening.
I have a sense, but not a very good one.
Instead of critically looking at that, it takes it as a given that that's exactly what we should be doing, and all we can be doing in North Africa. And if you just run the numbers, right, to put one American soldier in the field, and this is if he's just a GI, a private soldier, it's $1 million a year. 6,000 guys in Africa, that's $6 billion a year. That's the lowest possible estimate. Now, we know we're also sending guns, we're sending ammo, and we're sending all sorts of support equipment, and who knows what else. So the figure is going to be way above $6 billion. But you channel that into maybe productive aid programs. Rob talking about the courts in Somalia. The reason those encounter success is because people on the ground are just looking for law and order in their lives, right? Maybe you invest in some programs that create law and order versus just shooting people up. It's incredible that in 2018, we can still be talking about American military intervention as the solution to terrorism versus the source thereof.
Exactly. It's extraordinary. So I think just as an example of how little we know and how frightening that is, and how many questions that inspires, there's the example I talk about a lot. I believe it was last October or November. 4 U.S. Special Forces guys were killed in Niger. Now, it's really shocking, actually, now that I think of it, that this Economist article didn't mention that. Because, I mean, that's certainly the most newsworthy piece of, most newsworthy item to come out of the region discussed in this article in the past year. And it's directly relevant to what they're talking about. Niger is one of those countries that is the target of US and French intervention. And what was so staggering about that was that we just didn't know what was going on in Niger at all. Lindsey Graham famously was like, wait, we have Lindsey Graham, Republican senator, who's makes it his business to be, the foreign policy hawk and supposedly an expert on these issues and terrorism and counterterrorism and what we're doing. His quote was, "We have 1,000 people in Niger?" He had no idea. And what we have in Niger. I'm sure that the journalists, the big journalism organizations have part-time stringers. I'd be shocked if they had full-time stringers. So stringers are essentially like freelance, right? Like sort of freelance journalists that work
sort of like a retained freelancer.
Yeah, retained freelancer. I'm sure that at least 2 or 3 of the bigger names in U.S. news have sort of part-time stringers in Niger. But Niger is a country with a strongman. Sadly, I can't pick his name out of my rotted brain, but it's a strongman place. And what our special forces are doing, supposedly, primarily, is training his military forces. So the story that we've got, more or less, is that there was a pitched battle in which 4 of our guys died between our special forces and Nigerian forces, not Nigerian, Niger. The military forces of Niger, Nigeria and Niger are different countries. Sort of Niger military forces versus jihadists or ISIS, or we don't know who these people are really at all. This sort of ISIS is everywhere thing, which definitely this article plays into, relies on the fact, or sort of ignores the fact, that ISIS is kind of a brand that had a great media, was a great media hit, had a big public relations success in 2014. So all kinds of groups all over the world affiliated themselves with ISIS just because they thought they could maybe get some funding out of it. It seemed cool. Obviously not our version of cool. So whether or not, and it's not even clear whether these folks that the strongman says were ISIS actually claim to be ISIS. So we just have no idea what's actually going on here. We have no idea. I mean, these folks could have very legitimate reasons to be fighting against this guy. I think it's very, very likely that these folks are a different ethnic group from the guy who runs Niger. I don't have any of these details. Nobody does, because what most publications do is reprint the Department of Defense's press releases on this. And that's pretty horrifying, because we've got U.S. soldiers dying on the ground in conflicts that they're not supposed to be in. That's definitely something worth mentioning that just sort of got left out. That's the world we live in. And The Economist, that on some issues can do an excellent job of looking into different sides and providing great reporting, just basically puts out this puff piece for the military-industrial complex here, and it's really disturbing, and it's really problematic. I don't actually have a link to this article in the.
I stuck it in the chat.
Oh,
you can't make a direct link in the chat, so I had to cut out I had to space it out, but it's in there.
It's in there. Okay, well, I'll put it in the description when we're done here. I do have the description of the other 2 articles I wanted to talk about.
I've got one other thing to say about this, which is, so there's this other paragraph in Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, right? Which is, and I'll explain how this relates in a second, which is, quote, "In normal times, as well as in periods of red scares, issues tend to be framed in terms of a dichotomized world of communist and anti-communist powers, with gains and losses allocated to contesting sides, and rooting for our side considered an entirely legitimate news practice," unquote. That didn't come out well. So obviously, we're no longer categorizing the world, except on Fox News, in terms of communists and non-communists, right? But something that's grown up, I mean, it dates back to before 9/11, but something that's grown up strongly since 9/11, even in publications like The Economist, when they're writing about Syria in depth or whatever, are very careful to delineate different groups and different kinds of Islam or whatever. But we very much created a narrative in the West where Islam is one monolithic thing, the same way that communism, or even sort of left politics back in the day, was one monolithic movement. So that's how we explain to ourselves, even as far back as the 50s, stuff like a coup against Arbenz, who's in Guatemala, who's like a little bit socialist, Well, we lump him in with the communists. He becomes an existential threat. And then we can treat him the same way that we treat, Fidel Castro or whatever. And what we get in this article, Ali Razi in the chat said that ISIS is not Boko Haram. True. But U.S. media doesn't always make that distinction, especially in pieces this short. The same thing about Sharia courts in Somalia. We think of Sharia as one unified body of law, but it's not. It's different everywhere it's ever been implemented. There is no Catholic Church of Islam. And articles like this in The Economist, which conflate all different kinds of Islam, all different kinds of jihadism, they help to create the narrative that it's sort of this world existential, almost conspiracy that we have to fight with American military power versus local religious, rhetorically religious manifestations of local politics, which is what it actually is.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if I brought that off like really clearly.
No, but that's an excellent point. We love this article is an example of that. We love to look at this conflict as if it's just one big conflict, which is ridiculous. Every single place where the United States is involved militarily has a whole range of factors that are unique to that place. And what's annoying is actually by injecting U.S. troops into the situation, we act to turn it into one larger conflict. Because, say we're in Niger, we're protecting the strongman, we're helping the strongman build a bigger and better repressive apparatus, then yes, the United States becomes the enemy. So, enemy of my enemy is my friend. So then these Niger guys who don't like the strongman because he's not in their ethnic group, or he doesn't do religion the way that they want to do religion, or because he did a deal with some company that's really bad for that area's economic interests, which is almost always the case. It could be any number of things. But because U.S. forces are there, arming and protecting the strongman, and ISIS is out there, sticking it to the U.S.'s interests in 2014. So these guys are like, sure, let's pledge an affiliation to ISIS. And it works both ways. It's not just an incredibly stupid way to view a conflict. The United States, it also, when U.S. troops, U.S. advisors, U.S. trainers, just plain U.S. weapons and aid get involved in all these minor, tiny conflicts, it also encourages the people who don't like the side we're supporting to become more anti-American and be part of ISIS. And that's a very key thing that always gets left out. Like, the degree to which these folks have any real contact is overblown. I mean, sure, they can use similar ideology, they can cut and paste similar press releases, but the question of whether there's any sort of strategic communication, transfer of fighters, weapons, money, anything like that, is just left out of any of these discussions. It's not seen as relevant because they cut and pasted the same press releases, and that's really absurd, and it functions once again to forward the military-industrial complex's approach, which is we need more money, more troops, more weapons everywhere all the time, and it's a real freaking problem. And thank you for highlighting this article. It's I think it made this video better and more relevant than it would have been otherwise. Anything more on this particular?
Just to boil down what I said and to top off what you said. If Islam is one thing everywhere, if jihadism is one thing everywhere, then one solution, or you can make an argument, a bad argument, to use one solution, which is American military power everywhere. But if Islam is always a manifestation of local politics, then it's a much more complicated question. And the solution is much more complicated. And it means, giving aid programs to countries in North Africa. It means working to construct civil society in those countries. And all of that is way harder than sending in some Green Berets to do some cool shit with, hand grenades or whatever.
So what convinced me to do this video was just sort of a 1-2 punch of two articles that I was reading in The Economist a number of just a couple days back. I will often buy The Economist on the newsstand, and I don't quite read it to cover to cover. I mean, in college, I used to get high and read this cover to cover, but I had more brain spells back then. But I bought this issue of The Economist, and I was on page 64, the Buttonwood column, in an article entitled "The Index Fear," and it's listed in the description. There's a link to that in the description if you guys want to take a quick look at it. So what gets me here, and I think this is probably an experience that everybody has had when reading an article of journalism. It's in any publication. If you don't know anything about the topic, you can be like, oh, well, okay, that sounds interesting, and I learned something. That's great. But if you do know something about the topic, really almost anything you read on it is going to piss you off. So with this first article, the Index Fear article, I think I got really angry when I read it, but I think I might be being a little bit unfair, because most of this article, with the exception of the last two paragraphs, actually does a great job, I think, explaining an issue that's very interesting and very important and fairly complex, and it does a great job of explaining what's going on with it. It's discussing the conflict between index investing or passive investing and more active management. So for forever, what you would do if you wanted to invest and you weren't like super savvy and you didn't have the time to sort of follow everything, is you would deal with a particular stockbroker or a wealth manager or investment advisor, and they would help.
Yeah, Rob. Got mysterious noises downstairs. I'm going to pop down and be right back up.
All right, I'll be glad.
Keep reading the article.
Yeah. So you would deal with someone who was an expert and was going to pick your stocks for you. And what happened in the 70s, which the article does a great job of describing, is it was sort of the rise of index investing. One of the products related to this is sort of exchange traded funds. You might have heard of ETFs. The idea being that you just invest in a fund that buys all of the stocks that are the components of the S&P 500 or the Dow Jones. And it's been shown over decades now that you can actually do better by just buying that basket of stocks than you can do by paying somebody, sometimes significant percentages of your money to find the right thing and do this, that, and the other thing. And in the last two decades specifically, those guys have been doing great. Those guys have been, the non-active investing, the passive investing, the index funds, the ETFs have been doing amazingly well. They've been doing really great. So what this article does is sort of introduce this concept in a very, very clear way, much better than I just introduced it, and sort of deals with this issue. It does a really great job, and it sort of plays, okay, so what does this mean for the markets in general, this, that, and the other thing. But then in the last couple paragraphs, they leave out something so freaking massively important that it just really sort of ground my gears. They say, they're talking about, perhaps the growth of indexing has robbed the world of outstanding stock pickers. But it seems more likely that it has put a lot of bad managers out of business, just as Samuelson hoped. This is true. This is great. That's one of the benefits of passive investing, is that you have less sort of unscrupulous or untalented stockbrokers sort of robbing money from people to waste their money. I mean, that's one of the great things about this. This is true. And it's not as if the buying and selling of stocks by informed investors with opinions has ceased. The turnover of stocks has actually increased over time. Active investors are more active than ever. Why do they bother? If the rise of index investing means less dumb money, then it is harder to beat the market. Yet it goes against human nature. Okay, blah, blah, blah. So this here is one of the most infuriating passages I've ever read in The Economist, because this wasn't a mistake. This was a choice to leave out a tremendous amount of detail. This article that had done such a good job to this point is now pretending that all that really matters for markets is this conflict between active and passive investors. And it sort of leaves out tremendously important aspects of this, because it's not just about whether you're dealing with somebody who can pick stocks well, or you're just going with index investing. It's significant percentages of the actual money dealt with in the stock market are controlled by massive organizations that have powers and abilities to manipulate the market. Manipulate is a very strong term, but powers and abilities to influence the market that are well out of the range of any individual investor or consumer reading this publication. And the fact that they could just leave that out entirely is so infuriating. To sort of look into it, I mean, in a little more detail, you've got hedge funds, private equity, well, not private equity, it's different. Those are generally not dealing with public markets, though they sometimes do. You've got sort of hedge funds that can go into strategies that are tremendously complex and are likely to bring a better return, dealing with stock options, dealing with this, that, and the other thing. And these strategies, even though it's probably only, a couple thousand individual entities, the amount of money that they deal with and put into these really complex strategies and whatnot is, probably outweighs all of the individual investors that this article is geared towards. So that's one thing. But I think I could forgive The Economist for sort of leaving that out. I mean, this article does a great job sort of pointing towards an important issue and educating people. It's great. But this active investors are more active than ever, and aren't they silly, just leaves out one of the more controversial elements of markets over the past 10, 15 years, and that's high frequency trading. That's basically the fact, you might have heard, that one of the first realms to have been completely transformed by artificial intelligence, by robots or what have you, is actually the trading of investments on stock markets. So what high frequency trading does, it's sort of dubiously legal, but what it means is that incredibly large chunks of stocks can be sold and bought by computers. And this actually, you can argue that this does make markets more efficient, perhaps. But what it means is that these computers who are buying and selling these chunks of stocks can profit from these motions. It's a kind of arbitrage. These motions of the market, just by virtue of how large they are. So he's talking about this, active investors are more active than ever. They must, they're just a bunch of freaking morons, No, actually, these active investors that are more active than ever are robots that are making great deal of money off of these markets. And the fact that they could just leave that detail out because it doesn't serve their thesis is really, really infuriating. So I don't know, perhaps I'm being a little unfair with this article, but that just really jumped out at me, because the volume of daily trades, I have an article called up on this, over the past 10 years, the volume of daily trades that happens through these high frequency trading algorithms, the volume of daily trades. Now, this isn't the money that's actually traded on the markets, but this is because these high frequency trades, I mean, they can just turn over the same amount of money multiple times in a given day. But as far as like the volume of daily trading, in 2005, it was 20% of all the trades that were made on the market. And by 2016, it was 50%. So half of all the trades, this is what he's talking about when he's talking about active investors being more active than ever. Half of all the trades on US stock markets today are done by robots who are making a great deal of money in ways that are not available at all to either active or passive retail investors. So basically the last two paragraphs of this article make the whole thing kind of a lie by just sort of leaving out really vital information. And that really bugs me. So that would be one example of how the markets are full of it. And, maybe I'm being unfair here. This one I'm not, too sure about. But on page 67, we've got something I'm very sure about, which is one of the worst pieces of garbage I've ever read in The Economist. But before we get to that, John, do you have anything to contribute on the topic of passive investing, active investing, high frequency trading, or anything I've just said?
Not in particular. No, not really. I'm not a huge stock market guy. And I'm not huge on it, especially in the sense that I don't think the strength of the stock market accurately reflects the strength of the economy. Growth in the stock market benefits benefits a lot of people, but to the exclusion of like the bottom 60% of the population of the United States, which holds a negligible amount of stock. And in part because of high frequency trading, where there's an old Prospect article that quotes a book by somebody Patterson, Dr. Patterson. But the average period the average holding period for a stock at the end of World War II was 4 years. By 2000, it was 8 months. By 2008, it was 2 months. And in 2011, there was an estimate of 22 seconds. That looks pretty soft, but it's gotten a lot quicker.
Yeah.
And the volatility that results from that, I don't know is necessarily a positive thing, even if at the moment the market's growing. But I don't have any particular thoughts about this article. It's really more Rob's ambit than it is.
Yeah, it's funny. In the past couple months, I've gotten, I think, specifically motivated by the fundamental illogic and insanity of this whole Trump bump in the equity markets. I've been sort of diving back into this, and it's been kind of fun because it's. When I was in college, I thought I was going to be a stockbroker, and I spent a couple summers on Wall Street. I got a Series 7 equities. So I can't even remember what exactly the Series 7 is, but it was something that I was quite invested in and quite involved in, and I think it's allowed me to produce some interesting content on the channel over the past month. I've got this Markets Are Dumb series. If you just click on videos on my channel, you can take a look at those. And I actually dealt very specifically with what John was just talking about in my video on the Trump bump and why it's over. So I'd suggest taking a look at those if you're interested in this kind of blathering. But if this is all Greek to you, don't worry. We're getting back into our core competence here, complaining about the military-industrial complex. On page 67, we have an article in Science and Technology. That's the great thing. It's in an article that it's in a section that's just supposedly pitched as new developments in science and technology that are fascinating. But what it is it's a almost 2-page public relations article, not just for the military-industrial complex, but really for just a couple companies that are parts of the military-industrial complex. I actually think that for once in my life, I might even advocate for a defense contractor here, because I think Northrop Grumman should be really pissed off about this article. And this article deals with the F-35, which is one of the most expensive and outrageous defense industry projects of all time. It's quite disastrous, and it comes out of some biases and assumptions that this article works really, really hard to perpetuate. So, I mean, I think I can just launch right into it. John, do you have any comments before I get into it?
Well, I think this is another example of somebody taking the cheap route to production of news,
Yes.
which is the Pentagon or somebody put out a press release, and nobody read it that hard. And I think the peg was the air show, right? They had an F-35 showing up at an air show.
Yes.
Yeah. Somebody was out of time. They were short on words this month. They got an air show. They put it together with a press release. Boom, you got a news article.
Yeah. And what's so egregious about this is I don't think they even talked to anybody at the Defense Department for this, because if they talked to people at the Defense Department, they would have told them that what they're pitching as news is actually 15 years old. What I think happened here is this journalist talked to somebody at Lockheed Martin Lockheed Martin is the company that has birthed that hellish abortion that is the F-35 fighter plane. And it seems like they might have also called some folks at BAE Systems, which is, I believe, the United Kingdom's premier defense contractor, and talked about the Wharton Aerodrome, which is an R&D organization. So the pitch of this article is "Welcome to the Wingbot," and it's talking about this crazy new transition that might be possible. We might be living at the dawn of the era where fighter pilots are no longer necessary, and we're going to be able to see fighter drones who do everything that fighter pilots do, and that's crazy and new. And let's talk about what BAE Systems is putting together. Let's say, like, what's the best way to attack this?
Well, first of all, anybody who came of age in the 1990s and early 2000s should recognize this story because this story came out every week for 15 years. Every week on the History Channel, there was a show about the new future of technologized warfare, about self-flying planes. And this is not a new article. And the reason it sounds so familiar is somebody was short on words this week, and they picked a topic that they'd already read a million times before and wrote it again.
Yeah, that's true. But this is actually kind of more egregious because this gets into a distinction that's been made. I knew a lot of people who flew for the military. I know a lot of people who flew for the military, do fly for the military. And I've had discussions with them about, fighter pilots and like, why do we still have fighter pilots? And basically putting a fighter pilot in a plane is tremendously expensive. You've not just got to put together a platform that can go faster than the speed of sound and deliver a whole bunch of disgusting armaments. You also have to keep a human being alive inside of it. I can pretty much guarantee you that in the next real war, where something like the F-35 would be called upon, I'm envisioning probably, if we continue on the current path, something against China or some weird conglomeration of countries at some point, literally decades from now, maybe 40, 50 years from now. In that war, if there are still fighter pilots, they'll all die very quickly. There's no real good reason to have fighter pilots. Now, all my friends who actually fly this thing will, and I think anybody who's sort of well-versed in these platforms will tell you, oh, no, Robert, you don't understand. You're just, sure, the pop culture people will tell you we've got Predator drones and these sorts of things that can drop Hellfire missiles. But what you don't understand is what a fighter pilot does is infinitely more complex. There's the combat, there's the, they deliver much bigger weapons, and they have, they're able to direct them better. Now, that is absolutely true to a degree. But the reason it's true is because the platforms that would replace those fighter pilots have not been invested in at all. They exist. So I wanted to sort of quibble with you a little bit there, John, with what you're saying, because this isn't just another like, ooh, predators are crazy, or ooh, drones are crazy. What this is saying is specifically like, oh, now it's not true anymore. Now we don't necessarily need those fighter pilots anymore for these more complex, bigger, crazier, more involved platforms that used to be like the F-16, So that's what this is supposed to be saying. But what that leaves out, and why I think Northrop Grumman's PR folks should be really fucking pissed off about this, is so this pitches this amazing new BAE Systems thing. They've finally put together a drone that can really compete with fighter pilots. Well, Northrop Grumman put that together 15 years ago. And this, I think, gets into the deeper scandal of the F-35. At the cost of less than $1 billion, Northrop Grumman put together a working prototype that can land on aircraft carriers. That's one of those applications that supposedly drones were terrible at. Land on aircraft carriers, deliver munitions. I'm not sure how far the testing has gotten in actual combat-like situations, but there's a prototype that exists of a combat. You can Google it, of a combat thing. It's the Northrop Grumman X-47A Pegasus. It started development in 2003. They've been flying and are apparently incorporated in carrier groups, or they would be if anybody wanted to spend money on flying these things, on actually building these things, as long ago as 2011. So this article this guy didn't even bother to Google what he was talking about. So yeah, it's not just another Predator article. This guy is arguing in the Economist Science and Technology section that something is brand new that has existed for over a decade. And the Tyrannus platform that they talk about here, is something that's where the Northrop Grumman thing was in 2003. So it's talking about a 15-year-old innovation as if it's brand new. And this actually gets into the biases of one of the really key biases of the military-industrial complex that has made the F-35 so terrible. So we could already, at this point, 15 years later, be flying full fleets of autonomous drone fighter craft, combat craft, that would have no cost in terms of lives, would be dramatically easier to operate, would have had the hundreds of billions of dollars that were poured into developing this manned F-35 fighter pilot thing, had a tenth of that money been poured into developing these autonomous fighter platforms, they would have been able to do all the work much better at much less cost. And that is the problem. People blame fighter pilots for a lot. They blame the culture of the Air Force specifically for keeping autonomous fighters from actually happening. But that's not what it is. The problem with these autonomous projects, these autonomous fighter projects that are the future of warfare, that will be how all the next wars are fought, the problem with them is that they're too cheap. That's the main problem with these platforms. Because when you're not trying to keep some guy alive in this warfighting machine, they're higher performance, they can do the job better, but they don't cost as much. They don't cost anywhere near as much. Like I said, this fighter platform from 15 years ago that Northrop Grumman put together was working, put together, prototyped, fantastic, at a cost of under $1 billion. The F-35. Let's launch into the F-35. The F-35 program in total is estimated to have a total cost of $1 trillion. So that's 1,000 times more expensive. Now that's a little unfair. This $1 trillion figure, is actually almost certainly low, but what it refers to is the projected cost of the program over the entire life of the program. So we're talking 50 years or so. So it's not like the US government has poured $1 trillion into the F-35. There will actually be a lot of people making money off of this $1 trillion. It's the incredible complexity of this program. So the first thing to know about the F-35 is that it's a really crappy plane. It's designed as a platform that all of the branches of the US service can use, which means that it's not really well put together for anything. The Marines wanted it to do vertical takeoff and landing. The Air Force had a whole range of things that it wanted to do. The Navy and the Army all had things that they wanted it to do. And there's the sort of theoretically good idea that it'd be, wouldn't we save money if this were all the same platform? Has created this god-awful monster Frankenstein plane. In the past couple of days, at my Twitter account, @RobOLaw, I retweeted this really lengthy Twitter thread on just how nightmarishly bad this plane is at everything. Now, there are critiques of that thread, which has been retweeted, I think, probably 10,000 times over the past week, that I think are accurate. They're pointing out that, well, yeah, every plane has trouble when it's testing. Every, everything from the F-16 to every beloved fighter platform in the United States has, had these problems in the development phases. This is normal. Nothing about this is normal. First off, there's the issue that we should be building autonomous platforms. Like, no question. It's cheaper, it's better, it saves the lives of U.S. people. That's the sort of the most basic problem. And the costs of this have been so outrageous. To build a plane that performs poorly and is probably never going to be used for what it's intended for. It's just, like I said, it's going to be 50 years before we have a major great power war. The F-35, if any of them still exist right then, will be quickly destroyed. I don't know. I'm losing steam here. Do you want to?
Yeah. There's a few points to be made. First, just to hammer out those numbers a little bit more. The total cost of the program, we're looking at something between 1.2 and $2 trillion in today's money. So the eventual cost, in 50 years, when we're looking at the program back, will be 10 trillion or whatever in those dollars. But to today, that is if you adjust everything we're spending now for inflation. 50
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. But right now, looking backwards at what we've already spent, looking forwards at what we're going to spend in today's dollars, looking at between 1.2 and $2 trillion. The total cost of what we've spent already in today's dollars is something around 400 billion. 400 billion. Jeez. And the other problem with this Economist article, which cited 50 billion.
Sorry, we've already spent $400 billion on the development of this platform?
Adjusted to today's money. Yeah.
But that's for a platform we don't need to fight any conceivable war that does everything it's supposed to do very badly.
Yep.
Okay, got it.
And continuing along those lines, so the figure that the Economist article says 50 billion, which is just not right by any stretch of the imagination. It's hard to pin down numbers on the F-35, but 50 billion is just wrong.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is they cite the cost of the plane as 100 million, which is already unimaginably large. But in fact, that's not the cost of the plane. The basic model cost 150 million to make. The one that the Marines wanted cost $251 million. And the ones that the Navy wanted, which have the fans so it can do vertical takeoff and landing, $337 million.
Jesus.
And one of the original pitches for the program was that even if you produce different variants, A, B, and C, most of the parts would be held in common. So it would be cheaper to produce one platform that could be adjusted to different roles. Well, it turns out all of the variants, they only share 30% of their parts, which is pretty much the same as them being different planes.
Yeah.
So the program has fallen down on all of its original pitches. And then it's supposed to serve all these different warfighting roles. It's supposed to be an air-to-air superiority fighter. It's supposed to be an air-to-ground bomber. It's supposed to be a stealth plane. But it turns out all those roles are really mutually exclusive.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that all the platforms that it was meant to replace, you've been doing Vietnam recently, so you probably
We're still talking about propellers, C-119s, and C-47s. So yeah, I haven't even gotten to that.
You haven't gotten to the A-10 Warthog, right? That's a Vietnam plane, right?
Yeah.
I thought it was. So the A-10 Warthog, I am not an expert on this by any extent of the imagination, but my understanding is platforms like the F-16, F-22, all of these things, the F-35 was supposed to replace all this and make everything easier. I think an indication of how much people trust the F-35 is that none of these programs have been discontinued. We're going to continue buying and flying all of those old planes because nobody trusts this piece of shit. But of course, we're selling it all over the world. I think it was the Israelis actually used I think I saw a news item that the Israelis had used some of the first F-35s in, for whatever roles. Of course, they're not actually being tested for any of, the roles that they're supposed to be able to serve. They're just delivering some bombs, which could, easily have been done by any number of other things. But Lockheed Martin gets a press release saying, "Look, the F-35 has been used in combat." Like the Syrians are launching dogfighters or something like that. It's just atrocious. And yeah, I mean that's incredible that this article could put out a figure that's just so transparently wrong, and that's why I get the sense that almost the only person he talked to for this was a Lockheed Martin press person. I mean, it's atrocious. They never actually mention, I don't think, in the entire article that Lockheed Martin is the folks making the F-35. That's just not here. But in the second paragraph, they do mention Lockheed Martin's celebrated Skunk Works. Their celebrated and famous R&D facility that the British BAE Systems can only put together an unworthy copy of, which is just extraordinary. So I think it's worth mentioning that the sentence in this article that launched us into this very long rant on the F-35 platform comes very early in the article. It says, "The F-35 represents the best that the president has to offer in aerial military technology." I think you can get a sense from what we've talked about here that is emphatically not true. And once again, this article pitches as a brand new development, the advent of the autonomous combat craft, air-to-air combat, all kinds of other things, pitches that as a brand new development, yet it's existed for 15 years. This is aggressive garbage. Unfortunately, the Economist. No, okay. This really is aggressive garbage. I think this is bad even by the terms of Economist articles dealing with military technology, and I mean this is truly embarrassing. I look forward to buying the next issue to read the letters to the editor. There should be some pretty horrific ones. But it doesn't mean it's inconsistent with the approach. And I think what I've been talking about here, I think in the larger business section of The Economist, I think there's a lot of this. I think there's a lot of just boosterism for individual companies and their products. If it's important, if it's something people know a lot about, they'll be able to run something a little more critical. But it's actually just reading this article is going to make me so much more skeptical of anything I read in the science and technology section of The Economist. Who are they doing PR for? Because this article is public relations for The Economist.
Well, I think the question
very, very transparently, to the point that even other defense contractors like Northrop Grumman should be pissed off.
Well, I think the question we can ask that'll start to tie together all the different threads that we've looked at in this episode that'll sort of square the circle for us is, if the technology to create autonomous warfighting drones already exists, if the F-35 doesn't serve any of its combat functions, and it's looked that way for like 10 years now, so we could have shut down the program. If all the other older models of planes, given the kinds of wars we're fighting right now, still serve all of the roles that they used to serve, if we're not looking at any imminent conflict with any other large power, and that we're really looking at continually bombing, as Saul Gutierrez said, other poorer, browner people all over the world, why the F-35?
Wow, Saul Gutierrez is being very rational today, but sorry, sorry.
So why is it, Rob, that we're developing a plane that doesn't work? That's more expensive than not only any other plane in history, but any other military technology program in the history, at least of the United States. Why are we developing the F-35?
The history of humanity, I'd say.
Well, fair enough, but what's the purpose? What's the purpose of this plane whose parts are produced in all 50 United States and 50 countries around the world?
Yeah, I think there was a great so that Twitter feed, I think that you can find on my that Twitter thread, that epic Twitter thread on all of the F-35's problems that you can find on my Twitter account at RoboLaw, was, I think, prefaced by, I tweeted somebody else's tweet of it, and he said, "What are you talking about? The F-35 has served its purpose perfectly. Its purpose is building mansions for generals and defense contractors in suburban Washington, D.C., in the Maryland and Virginia suburbs around Washington, D.C. What this is a tremendous, tremendous, tremendous money spinner. And it's not just the United States. I believe, for some reason, it sticks in my head, I think parts of the plane are being manufactured in Italy, and parts of the plane are being manufactured in a wide range of our allies. So this isn't just a fraud being perpetuated on the US people, it's being perpetuated on all of our allies as well, because it's provided jobs in our allies in all 50 states as well. So now all these places that have jobs related to this disgustingly useless platform are invested in its perpetuation. It's going to continue forever. Because jobs are on the line, because it's a money spinner. That's why we don't have tremendously more useful and effective autonomous combat craft now, because the money has been driven towards this. And this is not, the F-35 is, I think, a project that has been ongoing for 15 years now, at the cost of $400 billion, and is now finally getting...
Significantly longer than, I think it's much longer than 15 years, actually.
Really?
Yeah. Let me look it up, but keep going. I'll pull this up here.
So that's the thing, is that jobs depend on this in every congressional district. So everybody in Congress knows this. I mean, the people in Congress are pretty dumb, and they're pretty ignorant, and they don't know much. But I think even, the Louis Gohmerts of this world have got to be aware that the F-35 is a piece of shit. And it's kind of a disastrous, not very useful plane that costs ungodly amounts, but they're all invested in it. It's got jobs in all of their districts. And, I think that might be a little oversold. That provides political protection for them, but also all of these individual Congress people and all of these generals, all of the folks dealing with it, the tens of thousands of security analysts and think tankers and this, that, and the other thing. Lockheed Martin provides potential jobs for them. It allows them, it's job security. I mean, that $400 billion that has been spent on the X-35, I mean, that doesn't just go into, it's probably I don't know, maybe half of it, or maybe, optimistically, 3/4 of it actually goes into operating those assembly lines and all those congressional districts. Mm-hmm. But a solid quarter of it goes into the pockets of the people around it,
Yep. And
it goes into Lockheed Martin's profits. It goes into the profits of all of the probably thousands of subcontractors that are involved with this. It goes into the consultants and lobbyists that sort of make the case for this, that make sure that pieces of shit like this Economist article get published. Mm-hmm. The public relations people, this, that, and the other thing. It is a tremendous scam, and it's atrocious, and it continues. It's funny, Trump actually tweeted against the F-35 a bit as a candidate. Now that he's in Washington, D.C., strangely, we haven't heard anything like that.
Mm-hmm. So two things. One, the F-35 has been in development since 1992.
Oh, wow.
The 26th year of the program.
Wow.
And Israelis just now used it for the first time as an actual vehicle for destruction.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. So I want to circle back to something we talked about at the very beginning of the show. That's going to tie a lot of this together, I think. which is that we explained the word neoliberalism, right?
Yeah.
And the word, as defined by the people who came up with it, people like Milton Friedman at the Chicago School of Economics, would like to define neoliberalism that way. That is, it's about free market economics, it's about the lowering of trade barriers, and it's about free trade across borders, right? That's what they'd like you to think of the word neoliberalism.
Yeah.
But every time that anybody has ever been able to implement it on any kind of scale, with any kind of freedom, for example, Milton Friedman went down to Chile after Augusto Pinochet effected a coup against Salvador Allende, and Milton Friedman designed the new Chilean economy. Him and a class of Chicago economists. And what happened in Chile is indicative of what neoliberalism champions all over the world, which was the privatization of public wealth. Chile at the time ran a more or less successful welfare state. It was more social than the United States. The state owned a lot of utility companies. It owned stuff that was later privatized. Just stick with me, Rob. That was later privatized under Pinochet. So what happened in Chile was that you had a large middle class that immediately became a massive lower class, and you had a very small class of people that ended up in charge of what had been public wealth, who ended up very wealthy, right? So we can look at the same kind of thing going on in the United States. We'll get to Lockheed Martin in a second. But if you look at stuff like, for example, the 2008, tying in those markets we were talking about, the 2008 financial crash, what happens there is the market, the private market, creates a huge amount of risk, a huge amount of debt. It privatizes all the profit from that debt, and it makes the risk public. So when the whole system goes down, who pays to bail the banks out? Well, the American taxpayer. But who made all the money? Well, not the American taxpayer. And if we look at something like the F-35, it's exactly the same thing. We have a huge amount of public money going to the development of a weapon, the profits from which are all private. And even extending the definition of the word profit, we as the public, we're not even going to profit off it in the sense of having an effective warfighting vehicle. All of the profits, all of the money, all of the efficacy of the program goes to the guys who run Northrop Grumman, the lobbyists who shill for it, and the newspaper men working for the Economist, or magazine men, who reprint those press releases and benefit from the whole cycle churning public money into private profit. And that's the real meaning of modern neoliberalism. I'm on board with Rob on free trade. I'm not on board with the modern practice of free trade.
I think there are elements of what you said that I agree with, but I think you're really conflating a whole bunch of things to make a broader critique that, might make sense in
the modern neoliberalism, the modern neoliberal consensus, it encapsulates all that different stuff.
But I'm actually quite of a fan of some aspects of the neoliberal consensus. I would agree that in places like the United Kingdom and the United States, we've had a little too much neoliberalism or Anglo-Saxon economics or what have you. And I would absolutely I agree on your critique of the too big to fail banks. I think that those are garbage. I agree with the critique of the military-industrial complex. I think that's nightmarish. And I do agree that I think you're right in that in the United States, in the United Kingdom, there has been, perhaps privatization has gone too far, perhaps this sort of thing. But I also think there's a spectrum here. I think Chile is doing pretty great. And has been for quite some time.
Because I think Milton Friedman their economy, because they got rid of the dictator and they went back towards what they had been doing beforehand.
Yes. Yeah. No. I agree that the Chicago boys down with Pinochet are lamentable. That's really shitty. But I think it's also interesting that people really gravitate towards that one example because it makes the largest story sound terribly sinister. Whereas I do think that elements of neoliberalism, the Washington consensus writ large, what have you, and there are many other examples than just Chile where it's gone desperately awry and it's been a real problem. But I do think that it's also, I like economic growth. I think it has facilitated economic growth across the world. I mean, obviously the Chinese Communist Party is nobody's idea of neoliberal, but there are elements of this toolbox that they have used to bring hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. I think that
Sort of neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics.
Yeah, right. I do think that there are elements of the neoliberal Washington Consensus toolbox that have been vital to Africa's sort of emergence from the sort of decades of non-growth that they had after independence. So I don't think it's quite as black and white a story and quite as totalizing. Like I think at this point, say Argentina, for example, I am not. I mean, what's so sad is that they had, their horrific dictator, but they didn't have the sense to hire some Chicago boys. And if they had, I think Argentina would be in dramatically better shape. I mean, Argentina was historically a much richer country than Chile. That is no longer the case. And I think, the legacy of the Kirchners, people who I think have advanced exactly the critique that you just laid out of neoliberalism, Pinochet, et cetera, drove their country into the ground by being as anti-neoliberal as possible. So I think it's a spectrum, and I don't think any of these issues are quite as simple as you laid out there.
Well, I think the issue we're having here is, on one side, you have free market economics, which is what classic neoliberal thinkers would like to portray modern neoliberalism as.
And I agree.
International free market economics, I'm on board with it, man. I'm with you. Free trade, good.
Yeah.
But modern neoliberalism as practiced is the thing where the United States uses the International Monetary Fund and uses the WTO to force countries to lower their trade barriers, to destroy their welfare states, to lower taxes, to fit themselves into a neoliberal consensus box. It doesn't always fit the country, it definitely benefits us. And especially in practice, not in theory, but in practice, the privatization of public wealth.
I think you're totalizing again. And like when I say neoliberal, I'm talking about a batch of philosophies, toolboxes, a toolbox of approaches to things. And I guess as someone who would call himself a neoliberal and an advocate for those sorts of policies, I would, of course, try to make this box much smaller. What I get the sense is that you're saying, and I think it is fair to say that neoliberalism writ large has been the guiding ideology of the past 40 years or so. What I, as someone who would, generally see himself as a neoliberal, would say that many of the examples you point to are failures. Instances where sort of good neoliberal ideas were corrupted by crony capitalists, or it was implemented incorrectly, that sort of thing. Like, I think a great example would be like, okay, so the same set of ideas, the same toolbox was implemented in both Poland and Russia. The same philosophies. I think, actually, I'm sure Friedmanites or sort of, Chicago school disciples played a part in both transitions to capitalist.
Yeah. And they both feature in Naomi Klein's book too.
What's that?
They both feature in Naomi Klein's book too.
Yeah. Like Russia's experience has been really, I'm not even 100% sure that Russia's experience has been uniformly disastrous, but I don't think that anybody would dispute that it's ended up in a place that nobody likes and was poorly done from the very beginning, and it's just a shit show.
And it's exactly what I'm talking about.
What's that?
It's exactly what I'm talking about. You had the entire state apparatus under the USSR sold off to what's now become a ruling class of oligarchs. The privatization of public wealth.
Let me finish. So yeah, that's what happened in Russia, and it sucks. But Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary to a degree, implemented a range of and I think, I believe shock doctrine is a derivative of shock therapy, which was the policy that was intentionally implemented. And while we can certainly all have our quibbles with the current Polish and Hungarian governments, it fucking worked. Like, it worked well. Poland is now getting to the point where it's richer than Spain, which is extraordinary when you consider where they were in 1989. So we're talking about differing implementations of a sort of an ideology. I think what you're trying to construct a broader critique of is the world as it is neoliberal, and I would dispute that. I would dispute that, I think, quite vigorously. I think that the neoliberalism that I support, the sort of Washington consensus reforms that I've been pleased with, are just aspects of what has happened in any given country. And I know that Naomi Klein and others have certainly sold a lot of books by tying everything to the decisions of certain entities, institutions, and philosophies. But I don't think that's fair.
Well, I think again, we're running up against a problem that's not really a disagreement of ours, but a problem of definitions and semantics. You call yourself a neoliberal, but I think what you really are is like a classical liberal. No?
Well, yeah, sure.
Well, that's the thing. Neoliberalism, at least in my sphere, has come to mean this other body.
Yes.
Not just classical liberal economics, but the imposition of a sort of a different philosophy, one that's more in line with stuff that
yes, I know. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's very true. But I could actually point to successful IMF programs. There's a lot of them actually. Places where all the money was paid off, it worked out. Actually, the United Kingdom is actually an example of that. Turkey completed its IMF packages, and I'm not going to Google it right now, but I would assume there are dozens and dozens more. Are there places where the IMF participation was just another disaster? Yeah, absolutely. But I think that those examples, like Pinochet and the Chicago Boys, get highlighted not unfairly, because these are cautionary tales we should all be aware of, but they get highlighted disproportionately. I would argue, and
I think
I love somebody WTO, but you might have a rejoinder before that.
Well, somebody mentioned something along these lines in the chat that I think is indicative of what my real feeling towards what I understand to be the neoliberal or Washington consensus, which is that the point of all this, and I think its domination of the philosophy of the big international monetary institutions is more of a symptom of the last maybe 15, 20 years. But the point is to crack open protected economies and expose them, expose their profit-making potential to international capital, right? So the reason Chile upsets us isn't that socialism in a vacuum upsets us. We want to crack that open to let our money invest there and make profit off of it. Mm-hmm. And what I would argue, and this is what somebody in the chat said, that the successes of neoliberalism are byproducts. They're not the goal. They're just something that sometimes happens. People are always going to make money, and sometimes the country in question works out. And I think Turkey is not maybe an excellent example of a success because, ideally the neoliberal approach should create an economy that works and that supports a politics that accords with classical liberalism, right? Mm-hmm. But we've got the opposite of that in Turkey. We've got an economy that works and a politics that's anathema to classical liberalism.
Okay, on one point, speaking as somebody who is in Turkey, yes, the political ramifications have been not ideal, and you can check out plenty of videos on my channel to talk about that. But in terms of the building of wealth, the building of institutions, the building of, I can't help but be impressed. That's the reason this guy Erdogan keeps getting reelected, is a lot of people have experienced a pretty extraordinary rise in their living standards. But what I do want to, and you made an excellent point, I think about 5 minutes back, that the neoliberal, you made other good points, but no, the one that I'm specifically going to talk to is that neoliberal, the word, is something you can find. You can spend hours going through fights over what neoliberal means on Twitter threads. People who I'm a big neoliberal and you're full of shit. That's not what I believe. Or I mean, you're absolutely right. It's semantics, and it's something that we can do for years. So unfortunately, I'm gonna sort of violate this. So say a classical liberal or a neoliberal person, to address your other point, would say that of course the benefits that accrue to countries are just a side product of greed and filthy lucre. I mean, that's as classical liberal as you can get. I mean, I don't, Adam Smith may be a roundly abused thinker, but I don't think it's mischaracterizing him to say that, yeah, that was his point, that there would be positive, that was one of his many very good points, that there would be positive ramifications from the exercise of greed and what have you. But I do say, like, I'm not completely against this idea that, yes, and I think that's why I think that Pinochet, Chile, and the Chicago Boys is a cautionary tale, and it is something that happened that was wrong, and that exists. That is the case, despite the fact that it may have ended up placing Chile in a better place. Now, I agree completely that these things have happened. I think that do you have a rejoinder to that, or can I talk about the WTO for a second?
Well, I think there's one point to add there is, I think if people go back and read Adam Smith, he's nowhere near as conservative in today's terms as people tend to think that he is.
No question. No question.
Yeah, no. But I think we've gotten to the point where we can recognize that a free market economy does not correspond as well to liberal democracy as we once thought that it did. Communism with Chinese characteristics has not produced democracy with Chinese characteristics in China.
Dude, man, I've done very angry videos on exactly this topic.
Yeah. So the other thing there is, yeah, look, we could say the WTO and the IMF and every other international monetary and trade institution are set up along invisible hand lines where the use of human greed creates wealth, and the other positive aspects are really side effects of that dynamic. But in an age when we recognize that economics don't correspond one-to-one to politics, and we're looking at a world order that we used to be shepherding, or at least used to pretend to be shepherding towards liberal democracy the world over, we got to look at the side effects versus the intended effect of the institutions that we run. And what I mean to say there is you take a case like Chile, and after the Chicago Boys went down, the Chilean economy for like 3 or 4 years, it grew like gangbusters. But it grew the way the U.S. economy is growing right now, where the stock market goes up, the total of wealth goes up, GDP increases, but the distribution of that wealth becomes massively unequal and results in a society that is less democratic and less well off in the aggregate than it was before. And we got to a point where that's got to be a consideration too. It can't just be the creation of wealth for wealth's sake. You got to look at the politics that result from the policy.
But Chile, I mean, you're talking about 3 or 4 years after the Chicago Boys did their work, and I mean, like that strikes me as akin to the Donald Trump has been president for 8 hours, so everything that's good about the economy is now his responsibility, and everything that's bad is Obama's.
Just to make sure that I'm not giving the impression that I'm giving an unfair characterization of what went on in Chile. Chile's economy grows in those 4 or 5 years because they sell off the assets of the state. And on the books like both. What happens is that the economy crashes, the majority of people end up in poverty, and Chile has since then climbed its way back up to the classically liberal welfare state that it was before the Chicago Boys went down.
But my take on the Chilean economy is that you can't look at the Chicago Boys legacy or really anything in economics and say that, what happens 4 or 5 years later is what's important, or exclusively what's important. I mean, it's what has happened in, I guess we're closing in on 40 years since. We're over 40 years since now. And I do believe that the success, I think you might argue that it's unfairly, I'm sure that Naomi Klein would say unfairly, that a lot of the success of the Chilean economy has been attributed to reforms that occurred under Pinochet. And it has maintained, as you pointed out, an incredibly democratic and the more socialist vein sort of political scene. I mean, it's Once democracy was restored, the welfare state was put back together, but it was a welfare state that was able to operate at a higher level because it had more resources, because the pie was much larger because of reforms that the Chicago Boys had put into place.
Yeah, I don't think that argument holds up to scrutiny. I mean, you can't work a counterfactual, but if you keep the Chilean economy in '73 in place and let it grow over the same period, I think it's hard to argue that you'd end up with something worse than what ended up at the end. And you do it without torturing, dozens of thousands of people.
Look at Argentina. But see, once again, you're not asking me to defend the Chicago Boys' policies. You're asking me to defend Pinochet, which is why this example is something that we hear about so much. I'm not going to defend Pinochet. I'm not going to say that it's a good thing, that it would be great if both Argentina and Chile had the experience that Costa Rica had over the past 70 years. Because they didn't. Huh?
I'm saying that if you keep the state in place that existed beforehand, which was doing just fine from the perspective of the average Chilean, and you let that grow over the same period, I think it's hard to argue that it would be worse than what we have right now.
I'm agreeing with you. I'm saying, so Costa Rica did away with its military in the 50s. So it got to avoid the sort of strong man, there were no hooks for the CIA to dive in on, they got to avoid this whole nightmare. Argentina didn't, Chile did not. These are countries that were similar, except I believe as recently as the 1970s, Argentina was much richer than Chile. Obviously, I think it would be better if Pinochet had never happened to Chile. Obviously, I think it would have been better if Varela and all his monsters didn't have control of Argentina. The Chicago Boys, Pinochet's choice to employ a bunch of neoliberal economists from the University of Chicago, had a very real impact on Chile. Chile is richer and, macroeconomically infinitely healthier than Argentina is today. Obviously, I'm not going to defend Pinochet, say that was a good thing. But I think that's sort of a counterexample. It's not like this sort of shock doctrine automatically, we put in a dictator and we throw these neoliberal guys at it. That didn't fucking happen in Argentina. Argentina had a similarly horrific situation with right-wing dictators. And, did manage to democratize, and thank God for that, and it's fantastic. But it's been, essentially 40 years of shit for them since then. Chile had a different experience. So I do think it's a little unfair to say that defending the Chicago Boys and what they managed to do for the Chilean economy is defending Pinochet. I would never do that. I think, like I said, it'd be great if they'd all had Costa Rica's experience, but they did not.
Yeah, I think we got to move on because we're never going to agree on that phrase. For you, it's what the Chicago Boys did for the Chilean economy. For me, it's what they did to the Chilean economy. And all success since has been reversing the reforms made by the Chicago Boys.
We're not going
to reach agreement right here. And I think we're moving on to the IMF, which now Saul Gutierrez is saying somebody loves the IMF. I think you should have a chance to defend that view.
Honestly, I am
or to talk about it.
Despite, I actually am not as well versed with the IMF as I would like to be. I should look into it. What's kind of fascinating is what I do know about the IMF and the World Bank is that they are, World Bank, I think less so, but because it always had a remit that was about development. But what the IMF is like it's a holdover from the sort of, I believe it was the Bretton Woods system that was set up after, I don't know anywhere near enough about this. It's an article. It's something I need to research more. But my understanding, I just don't understand money, which I think has been a theme throughout my channel. But my understanding is the Bretton Woods system set up fixed exchange rates throughout the developed economies, and there's very strong arguments that have been made. I can't speak at all to whether they're appropriate or not. That actually that was better for development. Europe had its miraculous decades. Actually, Latin America was in much better shape before we went to a free exchange rate. I don't fucking know. But what I do know is that the IMF was initially intended was a vital part of that structure, and sort of did the financing work, the banking, the the whatnot to make that fixed exchange rate regime survive. And sort of the IMF has sort of been in search of a purpose since the demise of that system in the 1970s. But I really don't know enough about the IMF and its action.
I could speak to this a little bit.
Okay.
Which is that Bretton Woods is of a piece with the United Nations, which is that it was a U.S.-led effort at the end of the Second World War to prevent the thing that had happened at the end of the First World War from happening, and to try to obviate the situation or the creation of a situation that would result in a Third World War. The whole Bretton Woods system was set up to create economic stability worldwide, to head off the kinds of economic conflicts that the impression was had resulted in the world wars.
Great Depression, yields Hitler, that kind of thing.
Exactly. So you look at something like the IMF, and its original role is to help to shore up economies that are in trouble. Everybody contributes to, or every developed economy that has spare money contributes to this fund, and it fills the role of almost what the Marshall Plan was in Europe after the war. These people need an injection of money. They get the injection. The world economy chugs on.
So as to maintain those fixed exchange rates, right?
I don't know a ton about the fixed exchange rate system, but the even larger top objective is just stability to head off conflict. Part of this whole world system that we want to use to prevent, future world conflicts. And the Neo-Kleinian way of looking at the IMF since the death of the fixed exchange rate system, and for the last 30, 40 years or whatever, is that it ceased to be a tool to create stability, and it has become a tool to impose neoliberal policies on countries. And the way that this is supposed to happen, and I'm sure, well, maybe Rob can speak about it. I can only speak to it from a Neo-Kleinian sense, which is that countries that in the past would have received an IMF loan whose only stipulation was pay this loan back, now, in order to receive an IMF loan, have to lower their trade barriers, have to sell off parts of their welfare state, have to pay down their national debts, a whole set of things to make those countries look more like developed free market economies. And that for the last 40 years, the IMF has been used as a tool to impose those policies on countries.
Yeah. I'll confess that I like many of those policies, though of course the one IMF program that I'm familiar with now is of course in Greece, and that's a freaking nightmare. So gosh, I mean, you can probably put together an abolish IMF hashtag on the strength of Greece alone, but I think you'd probably also have to abolish Germany as well. But anyway, that's a different. Basically, I just don't know enough about the IMF to speak to it in any detail. What I do know a fair amount about is the World Trade Organization and the WTO, and I think actually the IMF might fit into this as well. I certainly think the United Nations does. Is the World Trade Organization was sort of set up explicitly. I mean, not in terms of being forced. I mean, you sign up to the WTO and you sign up to a program of reducing trade barriers. You don't have to do away with trade barriers entirely. I think it's got something to do with the most favored nation status. You're basically, I think, obligated to treat all other countries the same. That's what happens if you sign up to the WTO. But what it definitely required from developing countries when it was first put together in the late 90s was you're getting access to all these markets, because the WTO had its predecessor in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, which was this very small, very exclusive club of sort of Western developed economies initially. And the promise that these folks signed up to, essentially the entire world signed up to in the 90s. And I think the list of countries that are not signatories to the WTO at this point is less than 10 countries. It's tiny. The promise that was made in the 90s was you sign up for this, and they understood, they went into it with open eyes, that actually this could in the short term be bad for us. This is developing countries, because we're going to have to reduce protections for our industries, this sort of thing. The promise was that if you sign up, then everybody's in this big club now, and you're going to have a role in deciding what the policies are going forward, deciding what the next rounds are, what the next things we focus on are. And obviously, as developing countries, this oversimplifies a bit, but I think in the aggregate, they were more interested in the liberalization of agriculture, right? Like, okay, so now we should be able to sell our agricultural products, which all countries have some of, to these big markets now, right? And they said, okay, well, you sign up and you take the developed countries said, okay, you sign up and you take our manufactured goods at better rates, and then we'll discuss it. We'll figure it out. We'll all figure it out together. And that sort of didn't happen. But what's kind of interesting about the WTO, and I think this path of evolution can occur with the IMF as well, the World Bank certainly, is that in 1999, the trade lawyers, the folks who put this together, the expertise, the ability to deal with this is such a deeper bench in the developed world, in the United States, in Europe, and Japan. Now, the bench is deeper elsewhere. The WTO has, there have been a number of enforcement actions carried out against developed countries by developing countries. It is an institution that has the potential to evolve. One of the Trump actions that I actually approved of was refusing to sign the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because what those organizations are meant to do, the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the TTIP, which is, certainly never going to happen because of the Brexit thing, or it's not going to happen within the next 15 years anyway, was the European version. And what happened with the WTO was this is really oversimplified, but this is sort of the story of the Doha round, was the developed countries said, you know what we need right now? We need a whole bunch, there we go, just the TTIP. What we really need the developed countries said, what we really need is some protections for intellectual property and some liberalization of services. And the developing countries were like, hey, wait, what's going on? You stop right there. Like, you told us back in 1999 that the next thing we were going to deal with was agriculture, and you're tremendously protected agricultural sectors so we could participate. And then the developing countries were like, yeah, but we really want to deal with services and intellectual property. And the developed countries were like, no, fuck you. Like, we're going to do what we want to do first. So the developed countries came up with the TPP and TTIP. So I think that's really kind of an interesting example of the way that these institutions, that I would absolutely agree when they were formed, are intended as instruments of US power, can evolve into something different and better. So I think the sort of Naomi Kleinian approach to these things, I think undersells the value that these institutions can have, because the WTO now, it's not quite there yet, but it is evolving in a direction of an actual even playing field and an actual tribunal where developing countries and developed countries can sort of compete with each other on more equal grounds. So I think that's... So I'm actually a fan of the WTO, and it's one of those really awkward situations where, certainly for the wrong reasons, I think Trump did the right thing by sort of doing away with the TPP. So that's my spiel on the WTO. I've got a video on this called "The TPP is Super Racist" that I would suggest folks go and find, because it is. It's fundamentally a really fucked up thing. Anyway, so perhaps that was just a ridiculous digression. But we're coming up.
Just to put in my last 2 cents there, talking about the international economic institutions in a Naomi Kleinian sense. Well, the Doha round never actually ended up liberalizing European and American trade policies on agriculture, which means that the WTO still serves that same purpose, which is it forces weaker, less protected economies to open up and allows us to continue doing the protection that we've always been doing.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a bit of an oversimplification, because I think the WTO, you actually can protect your industries under that, but you have to apply the same treatment to everybody else. I think that's how it works. It's been a while since I've been looking at the WTO in detail. I'd like to get back to it, but nobody watches the videos when I do them on the WTO. So maybe not. No, and I absolutely agree that while I do think the broader condemnation, I think the shock doctrine thesis is hogwash. Because if you think that Pinochet was the only dictator we threw together in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you clearly haven't been paying attention. But Chile is the only one that got the Chicago Boys. So I think those critiques are blown out of proportion. I absolutely agree that all of these international institutions functioned initially as tools of U.S. power, and that's still the way that they function today. But that's shifting. And I think that's something that should be, rather than just condemning the institutions in the whole, what we should be doing is looking at ways that we can facilitate that shift in this institutional architecture. Of course, that's good for the U.S. because no matter how much they evolve, it's still going to be going to have that bones and DNA that the U.S. put together. But I do believe that the world is better and better run and safer and more peaceful when we have an institutional architecture that's governing it, which is one of the main reasons I find Donald Trump so appalling. I mean, we've been doing this for 2 hours. Should
quite a long time.
Get into Q&A, or have you got something to close with?
Well, I got one last point there. Unless people start asking questions right now, there hasn't been a lot of Q&A material in the chat.
Yeah.
But one last thing is, yeah, certainly. I don't know that Chicago literally sent economists down to assist every dictator that we put in power, but I think it would be hard to find a dictator that we put in power who did not crack open his country's economy to be exploited by the United States, and who did not, in turn, purchase weaponry from the United States, propping up our own arms industry. You look at the coup against Arbenz in '54, the whole point of that is to protect the country for the United Fruit Company, now Chiquita Banana, and later for a whole range of other mineral extraction enterprises. You look at the Shah in Iran, it's about oil and it's about selling him weapons. You look at any given dictatorship.
Yeah, but
this is the difference. This is the difference that we've been talking about all episode. Yeah. Neoliberalism to you is a slight evolution of classical liberal economics. Yeah. Neoliberalism to me is a worldwide regime of what actually exists. I'm not looking at what Milton Friedman wants to pretend it is. I'm looking at its actual practice in the world.
No, yeah, I just don't. I think it's a little too. I think it's a little too totalizing a critique. But I think we can probably.
Yeah, I mean, we've already had our disagreement.
And we have our first question, and it deals with.
He asked this a while back, I think. Actually.
What's that?
He asked this a while back, actually. I think.
Well, I'm glad that he's brought it back. Mehran Zanjani asks, do you think the United States is actually supporting MEC, or do you think they're using MEC as a way to unite nationalist Iranians who are anti-MEC and anti-regime and then support that group? I don't think the United States has any idea what it's doing with Iran. So specifically MEC, it's not it's not a group that I know very much about. It's an Iranian dissident group. I've heard it described as
Mujahideen Khalq, I think.
Okay, Mujahideen Khalq. Yeah, I think that's right. I've heard it described as a cult. I've heard it described as a weird group. So what has happened recently, and I don't know, it could go back decades, is MEC is a well-funded, well-organized group of anti-Iranian regime folks. My understanding is that they used to be listed on the list of terrorist organizations. They have killed, they've carried out terrorist actions. They are no longer seen that way. What they do is they throw these large parties and conferences and whatnot that are anti-Iranian regime. And there are a number of figures. I know Rudy Giuliani, dipshit of all dipshits, likes to show up at MEC events. I know John Bolton likes to show up at MEC events. As far as like a really considered strategy of like, how are they going to sort of, pit one group against each other, I just think that these people knew that there was an Iranian regime event, and they decided to go there. I think the parallels are like Ahmad Chalabi, who was another sort of wealthy, well-connected, dissident against the Iraqi regime. I'm sure that there are elements of the U.S. government that are putting all kinds of inordinate hopes in this weird group of cultists that nobody likes. But as far as like in-depth strategies, I couldn't speak to it. I haven't done any individual research on what the mech is or is not. But I would be surprised. I would be deeply surprised if it was as sophisticated or well thought out as Mehran Zanjani's question implies. That's all I got.
I actually, we talked briefly about the MEK, which is the People's Mujahideen of Iran, in the Iran shows. They're a group that exists in this really interesting Iranian Islam of the 60s, where they're trying to blend left-leaning theory with Islamic belief, and it looks a lot like Catholic liberation theology. And the MEK was, yeah, it's crazy. It's really cool. And the MEK is a group that espouses this kind of ideology, first peacefully, then as a guerrilla movement against the Shah, which gets pretty effectively suppressed. They grow back up a little bit, and they participate in the Iranian Revolution, which was less monolithically Islamic than people tend to think that it was. They eventually fell out with the regime, and nowadays they're professional dissidents. People with very little actual political following in Iran, people who like to go to conferences, people who like to get U.S. sponsorship, people who like to misrepresent the ability or the capacity that they have to overthrow the Iranian regime, to scam money of the CIA. I'm sure the U.S. government's doing something with them, and I think it's probably a waste of money and unlikely to result in anything.
Yeah, I think it's sort of the Ahmad Chalabi experience, except with a much more with a much nastier organization. So yeah, not something that anything good is going to come from.
Yeah,
I think would be a good way to put it.
The U.S., as we've said in every show, the U.S. solution to Iran right now is to stay the fuck away and don't do anything.
Yep. That place, I mean, if it weren't for U.S. aggression, that place would have collapsed under its own weight. That theocratic regime would have collapsed under its own weight 15 years ago if it weren't for U.S. efforts in the region. But we're the main thing keeping them going.
Yeah. You see this BBT EZET question here?
You read it off.
Would you agree that the effects of globalization are international institutions at first were tools of U.S. economic order, and that now the effects are shifting towards serving the international elite?
You want me to take that first, or you want to?
Just BB. Okay. Well, the effect of globalization. No, globalization has been a process that's been on the march since the first days of human existence. And it ebbs and flows. Under the Roman Empire, globalization reaches a point it won't reach again until pretty much just before the First World War, collapses, and now it's on another upswing. Well, actually, right now it might be on a downswing, but globalization is a force that ebbs and flows throughout human history. What the order that we set up at the end of the Second World War was designed to do was to put us in charge of a global economic order that maybe produced stability as a byproduct of our being able to control that global economic order. But it's sort of a false question. It always serves the international elite. It's just we were the international elite for quite a long time, almost to the exclusion of everyone else. And what I think Rob's talking about, or was talking about briefly earlier, is that these international institutions are slipping out of our control. And you could maybe look at Donald Trump's sort of revanchement against, or retrenchment against international institutions as a response to us losing control of those institutions.
Yeah, I think you went super big picture on that, and in a way that I agree with wholeheartedly. I think that's absolutely right. But I would agree with BB's ZET. I think that the big picture John was talking about is very true. But I think sorry, BBZET.
This is just BB.
BB, just BB. All right. I think BB BB adds, talking about technology and possibilities that it brings, I think that with industrialization, the globalization potential and processes went into overdrive. I'm reading a great book right now called Heyday about sort of the 1850s, where it was sort of the first point at which sort of all of this stuff just started going apeshit. And yeah, no, I would agree with what John just said there and put a slightly different swing on it. I think that the post-World War II institutions, all of them, including actually the European Union, though it's a bit rude to point it out, are pretty much devised by and for the United States. But I would also say that there is a happy evolution going on. I usually put it in more positive terms than the question and the way that John put it, in that other countries are now able to exert themselves in these institutions, which we see a great deal of whining about in the United States. And I think that that's freaking fantastic. I think not the whining, but the process. I think the process is fantastic. I think that there never really has been sort of worldwide institutions like this. I mean, I'm sure there are scholars who, try to excavate, what is it, the Delian League or whatever, Thucydides was talking about with Athens or whatnot. But I mean, we since industrialization with the British and the United States, and after that, the United States, we now live in a time with truly worldwide systems. And what I believe we can do is have the current systems that we have right now evolve into something better, something that is, this is a terribly misapplied word, but, more democratic, at least in terms of, having more countries be able to take advantage of it. And yes, unfortunately, though, I wouldn't put it this way in my propagandizing. Yes, what that does mean is international elites. It means that the elites of China, India, Brazil, and to a lesser extent, the elites of all the other countries in the world will be able to have a bigger say. I think that's already happening. I think that's has happened at the WTO, which is why we see TTIP and the TPP. And I think that's a fantastic thing. And actually, one thing about all those other countries who aren't Brazil, China, Europe, Russia, sort of big swinging dicks, is that's the benefit that a system in these institutions provides. These individual little countries are never going to, really be able to constrain. Well, no, that's not true. Well, no. Like, are never really going to have a bigger constraining effect on the United States or China than the United States and China are going to have on each other. But in the context of a rules-based world system, there's some defense for smaller countries. There's some ability that they have to exert themselves against unjust actions by the larger powers. And I think that ability, that capability has the potential to actually grow if we're still dealing with a rules-based order in a more multipolar world. Sorry if that was too jargony. But if the whole rules-based order disappears, then we've got, just a war of all against all, and any country that isn't a great power type, whether in terms of population or economy or what have you, is going to get screwed. So while I think it's fair to say that, yes, it's turning from a system run by the US elite to one being run by different international elites, I think that's fair to say. I also think it's a good thing. So,
yeah, I'm on board with all that. I wish that the UN had a world army and that it ruled us benevolently.
Really?
Oh yeah, totally. But you're right about that. The United States and the other traditional leaders of those international institutions are maybe not losing so much as ceding control to other members of those institutions. But the real test of those institutions is going to come right now.
Yeah.
Donald Trump is a perfect manifestation of American anxiety about losing its place in the world order. And the response that I'd love to see, the United States goes from clear number one in whatever category you want to pick in the world, largely military dominance, to number two, or sharing power with China, or returning basically to a multipolar world. The change that I'd like to see is to give even more participation to those international institutions, because a rules-based order is the only one that's going to let us keep operating the way that we've operated, for the last 50, 60, 70 years. Donald Trump is the other response, which is to upend the gaming board as you leave the scene. Which, have we left NATO yet? Today's the last day of the conference, right?
Fucking NATO.
Yeah. So I have big hopes and small expectations for international institutions going forward.
I think that's fair. I have big hopes, and I'm more of an optimist, so larger expectations than John does, but I have great fears, specifically related to the figure of Donald Trump.
I'm not seeing any questions we necessarily want to get into, because they're like pretty far out of the talking about blockchains and
blockchains, Jesus.
And some other stuff that's not really in our wheelhouse.
Yeah. Do we have questions? Last call for questions. I mean, we have been doing this for, well, what do they say?
Remember, we're talking about international institutions, neoliberalism, and the Economist magazine.
Yeah.
Try to keep it,
or
more or less within that dartboard.
Yeah, I mean, or anything else that doesn't require a degree in mathematics. That's interesting. That's it. I think blockchain is actually kind of fascinating. I don't quite know enough about it. I think all the cryptocurrency stuff is. I'm sure that there's a Amazon and a Google somewhere in the mess of all the cryptocurrency companies, meaning something that's going to survive this current wave or what have you. But sort of an Amazon or a Google circa 1999. I'm sure there's one or two of those, but there are thousands and thousands of pets.coms, by which I mean stuff that people are just going to lose a ton of money on and are trafficking in air and hot air. Actual blockchain technology is fascinating in terms of the potential that it has. The idea of a distributed ledger and distributed record of truth or what have you, but we've seen very little worthwhile or interesting implementation of that. I think that's probably all I have to say about blockchain at the moment. Do we have any other questions? Anything relevant to what we've discussed today, or you can throw anything at the wall. We've got 17 people watching now. I'm sure somebody's got something they want to talk about. I'm happy to go a little bit longer. But I'm also happy to call it a day. So why don't we do our closing spiels, John, and then if somebody comes up with a good question, we can go into extra time.
Sure. I'm Jon Coumes. Like we said at the top of the show, I run the podcast Safe for Democracy, which you can find at safefordemocracy.com or by searching Safe for Democracy on any podcast app that you use. We talk about the failures and disasters of U.S. foreign policy. Our first long series was about the coup against Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954. The second one was against the coup against Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. The third one, we're talking about right now the run-up to the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, which means we're talking about the French War in Indochina. And you can see my map of Indochina back there on the wall there. Got a map of Dien Bien Phu around here somewhere. I'm about to stop that series and go to law school. So if you wanna be a part of it, check in the next month or so.
All right, there you go. I am Robert Morris. I am not going to law school. I already went to law school. I run the More Freedom Foundation. Every Tuesday without fail since March of 2014, I have uploaded a video dealing with some aspect of politics or culture. And now and again, I do a film review. I think I was so pissed off by the sequel to Sicario that I think I might do another one next week. But generally, I deal with geopolitics. I also try to keep a hand in on U.S. criminal justice, but it's unfortunately been about 6 months since I've done anything covering that. Specifically, I've got some pretty in-depth and continuing series on the conflict in Syria, the conflict in Yemen, the role of Saudi Arabia, and really went in with a series called Everybody's Lying About Islam, talking about the U.S.-Saudi relationship and the incredibly influential effect it's had on everything related to the war on terror, Islamophobia, this, that, and the other thing. It's, I think, probably one of the better things that I've done. I've published an essay, both available on the Amazon Kindle and in paperback, called Everybody's Lying About Islam, that I believe is very worth consuming, and most people who read it agree. Many people who did not read it don't think it's so great and have been voting it down on Amazon, which I dislike, but hey, them's the breaks. I will be continuing to produce content every Tuesday for at least another year or so. You can follow me on Twitter at RobboLaw. You can follow me on Instagram at The Golden Age. You can contribute to my PayPal account if you'd like to keep me going. There are links on the YouTube page, the YouTube homepage, and also I have a Patreon account that provides at this point the majority of my bread and butter. I am working on a long-promised book called Avoiding the British Empire that will attempt to lay out how the United States, as it falls out of its prime position, can avoid doing what the British Empire did and prompting a couple world wars. So yeah, I guess that's me. Thank you so much for viewing this entire production. I'm grateful for all of you, grateful for the questions, and very grateful to Jon Coumes, who's been a big part of live programming here. And I hope we'll get the opportunity to do at least another couple of these before he goes to law school. Maybe we can, discuss his law school experience. That could be amusing. It's sort of dimly remembered for me at this point, but I did law school once too, and had a great time. Not necessarily studying the law, but okay. Did any questions crop up that seemed really?
Limitations of environment regarding economy and increasing population, and then somebody wants to know if you've seen the new Jurassic Park movie. And then another one, which is the U.S.-Canada trade war real or political show? Well, it's the U.S.-Canada-Mexico trade war, and it's very real.
Yeah, very real.
Yeah, it's very real, and it hurt a lot of people. Yeah. Do you want to tackle environment, population, and economy?
Well, I think we did. I mean, if is this guy trying to prompt us into a 45-minute argument?
That's the problem with the question is.
Yeah, it's large. I think John would say that there are very real constraints to the environment. We're already operating at the outsides of them, and economic catastrophe is sure to come this week or next year. I would traditionally disagree with that quite strongly and think that technology will save us. Was that a fair summation of where we come up there, John?
Pretty much. Even if you believe that God's going to save us from climate change, we have enough people. The Earth is only so big; it's only got so many resources. Even if we want to have faith that science is going to save us, might as well stop using so many of those resources. Might as well rein it in a little bit,
I can't argue with that too much. I don't think God's going to save us. I think technology will save us, and I think we've got unlimited space in the United States. But I would agree that we don't need to be burning fossil fuels quite so quickly.
Yeah.
We already have the technologies necessary to get us away from that, and we should be implementing them more strongly. Sadly, the market is not quite to the point where it'll just do it by itself. We're closing in. Actually, if we had 4 years of Hillary Clinton, we'd have probably already launched into solving this problem. But I'm more optimistic than John is. I think that's all I got to say on that. have not seen Jurassic Park 2, but as I am in Turkey the next week or so, and I can go see a movie in the cinema for with popcorn and a drink for about $4, I might do. It's still playing here, so I'm pretty sure I won't like it. I didn't like the last Jurassic Park. Let's see. Okay, I think we can probably close here. What do you say, John?
Yeah, I think that's about right.
All right. I mean, with the very vital issue of whether or not, are you going to see Jurassic Park 2? I mean, inquiring minds want to know.
Didn't see whatever the last one was called, and I'm not going to see this one.
Yeah, the last one was garbage, but I'll see anything with explosions. So anyway, all right. I'm going to stop the broadcast here. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks once again to Jon Coumes for taking the time. I'm going to stop the broadcast now.